Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of August 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to those headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll discuss Kamala Harris's choice of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. We'll hear about budget shortfalls and veterans affairs that could impact payments going to veterans. And we'll look at the congressional report that says President Joe Biden and Vice President Harris's border policies have led to known or suspected terrorists being released into the United States. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Vice President Kamala Harris announced Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate, and they've begun campaigning together this week. Dan McCaleb is here to tell us more.
Vice President and presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris ended speculation this week about who her running mate would be when she tapped Minnesota Governor Tim Walz for the ticket. Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Casey Harper has the day off. So joining me to discuss this is the Center Square Regional Editor, J.D. Davidson, who, among many other states, oversees our coverage in Minnesota. J.D., while there was widespread media speculation for well over a week about who Harris would select as her running mate, Walz's name didn't really emerge as the frontrunner until the closing hours. J.D., are you surprised by the selection?
Dan, I think surprised is a good word. I mean, his name was always kind of in that lower tier, even when President Biden stepped aside. And they kind of centered around, amazingly enough, the states that I handle for the Center Square. There was Andy Beshear in Kentucky, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, and then there was Josh Shapiro and a few others. And then all of a sudden, then somebody would say, oh, yeah, Tim Walz in Minnesota. I don't think anybody 2 weeks ago or a month ago would have said this would have been the pick. And I don't have any special insight, and I don't think anybody does on how he moved to the front. But it is a surprising choice, I think.
Yeah, and voters now finally have some clarity after a crazy news cycle. So at least voters now have some clarity on who's going to be on their ballots come November, or if you vote early, on mail-in ballots, etc. Breaking news today, we are recording this on Thursday this week. Former President Trump had just held a news conference and essentially challenged Vice President Harris to 3 debates during the cycle.
He did, and I just read our story on the Center Square, and they're waiting to hear back from Vice President Harris, I believe. But, you know, it's interesting, the things that you say, you know, usually during the summer months in our business, we kind of hope for a news day or something that's not so boring. And we've been just going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week over the last 3 weeks. I mean, it's been amazing. And the whole campaign, it seems a lot like a marathon. It almost seems like the campaign's been going on for 2 months. And now my heart rate's up. This is almost like a dead sprint. With all of these things happening, and there's no opportunity to catch anybody's breath. And November will be here before you know it.
You got that right. Although for many people, it's like a sprint. For us, it's a sprint, but you got to stop what you're doing and cover something new because there's new breaking news when it relates to the presidential election. And in some states, those mail-in ballots, they're not that far from being mailed out, and people are going to start voting in this race, in this election.
Well, I do know this. So the issue with President Biden being on the ballot that led to this roll call, which technically the Democrats did not have to do, dealt with deadlines for military ballots being sent out in Ohio, which would come after the Democratic convention. So military ballots in the next couple of weeks, at least in Ohio, and I would assume several other states, are going to be mailed. So, and if you're overseas and you're in the Army and you get that ballot and turn it back in, within a month, some people will start voting.
I mean, you're right there, JD. Of course, after the Walz selection, Republicans immediately went into attack mode on his selection, making claims that he's as woke, quote unquote woke, as Harris, or worse, challenging his record on public safety and crime issues. Of course, Minneapolis, Minnesota is where the protests and in some cases rioting that started occurring or occurred in the wake of the murder of George Floyd there, saying that the governor of Minnesota, Walz, allowed that to happen. So it's just going to be a constant back and forth between now and Election Day, right? We're going to get hammered with campaign ads, with press conferences, maybe 3 debates, maybe less than that. But this is going to be a constant news cycle between now and then.
Oh, there's no end. And the difficult part about it is it won't be anything new. For the next 3 months, we're going to hear the same thing over and over again about Tim Walz, about Kamala Harris, about Donald Trump, about J.D. Vance. I don't know if this is good or bad, but both of the vice presidential candidates are in states that I handle. And yeah, I do know that Walz took some heat and still does on how he handled the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. On the flip side of that, the people in Minnesota are purplish, more bluish, and a lot of the social issues and education issues that with free, he did create free lunches and free breakfasts in schools, and he has created some other things. So I feel like that plays well to the Democratic base. J.D. Vance has the same issues in Ohio. The people in Middletown are not necessarily really happy with him. They don't care for him all that much. And the people in Kentucky really don't like him. But he plays well to the Republican base. And both of those guys can be, and we've already seen, can be the attack dog.
And of course, Trump has his own legal problems, scheduled to be sentenced ahead of the November election in the New York City hush money case. But we're going to have to leave that for another time. Thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all election-related news at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and JD. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the VA's budget shortfalls, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
A handful of congressmen are raising the alarm over budget shortfalls in Veterans Affairs. Joining me to tell us more is the Center Square's Alan Wooten. Alan, which congressmen are speaking out on this, and what are their concerns?
Well, the senators that are part of the Committee on Veterans Affairs have spoken out about it. Tom Tillis from North Carolina, Kevin Kramer from North Dakota, Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, Dan Sullivan of Alaska, and Mike Rounds of South Dakota. They are looking to have a hearing immediately rather than September 9 when session resumes. Their concerns are the immediate budget shortfall that is going to impact veterans getting benefits distribution as soon as October. And also the fact that the Secretary of the VA, Dennis McDonough, has told Congress as a full body that for this year and next year, fiscal 2025, they are in need of $15 billion. That's what they're seeing as their budget shortfall. The group of senators raised the question because it was just 4 months earlier that the budget for 2025 was presented. And so it is not really squaring up as to why a budget was presented. And then 4 months later, you've got a $15 billion shortfall that you're looking at. In addition to that, McDonough has been under pressure because at the end of last year, he was overseeing the department, and there were nearly $11 million in bonuses that went to career executives, and they were ineligible to receive them. So there are concerns about that. The Committee on Veterans Affairs, their responsibility is the oversight. That's part of the checks and balances of our system.
So what has led to this budget shortfall? Do we know?
Well, there's a variety of factors, and certainly the $11 million is a part of that. It certainly wouldn't make up for $15 billion, but the things that are happening with the VA now, you consider in the last 2 decades, we've been in some wars and that kind of thing, or at least some conflicts, depending on whether you want to call it a war or not. The VA budget under this administration has grown by 25%. That's not necessarily a partisan thing. The enrollments by veterans who have been added to health care during this administrative cycle is 3 million. That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of benefits. The VA distribution in 2023, for example, was about $163 billion to 1.5 million veterans. One of the other huge factors is the PACT Act from 2022. Now, this was legislation that dealt with veterans being exposed to burn pits, toxic substances, that kind of thing. It expanded health care for the veterans. But when that legislation went through, there were only 34 Republicans in the House who were in favor of the final measure. In the Senate, there were 14 Republicans who voted against it. As you can imagine, if you looked at the names of those, there would be the fiscal war hawks from both bodies. But the PACT Act has definitely had an impact on where they are right now.
Well, then what happens next with this?
Well, right now, it's really a race against the clock. I mean, time is dwindling down. Everyone is aware of it. Just this week, as we're recording, there's been no action on it as we speak right now. But on Monday, Maine Senator Susan Collins, she and 6 others of her colleagues introduced a bill that would fully fund veterans' benefits. That would take care of what's about to happen in October. With her on that were Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Patty Murray of West Virginia, John Tester of Montana, John Boozman of Arkansas, Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, and Jerry Moran of Kansas were the others. It's deemed bipartisan. She has an independent, and she also has a Republican who are involved in that. But she's filed that legislation. It is there again with the schedule for the Senate and the House for that matter. September 9, after Labor Day, is when they're scheduled to come back. That would be an awful tight fit. Certainly is doable. We know Congress can do things in a hurry when they want to, even in the dark of night, as it were. But they are up against the clock to be able to push something through to be able to take care of veterans. Personal opinion, I don't think that any of the lawmakers want to deprive veterans of what's going on and that kind of thing. I think the senators with the oversight responsibility are just making sure that they have done their due diligence on what has happened. That's part of the hearing. You ask about the reasons for why we do have the shortfall. That's one of the reasons why those senators are pushing to get a hearing as quickly as possible. They want to hear from the horse's mouth, okay, how did you go from presenting a budget 4 months later to telling us, oh, by the way, we need $15 billion right now because of this year and next? It just doesn't square up. So they're looking to get some answers there. I don't know of any senators or House members, for that matter, who do not want to do the best they can for all of our veterans. Yet, as you saw with the PACT Act, as we mentioned, there were some who felt like what they were trying to do was not in the best interest, and they voted against it. So we will see how they play this out.
Well, Alan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Alan. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the known or suspected terrorists entering the United States is our Cole McNeely.
A new congressional report this week states the Biden-Harris administration's policies are resulting in Border Patrol agents releasing known or suspected terrorists into the United States. Joining me to discuss this is the Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, Dan McCaleb. Dan, this is a alarming report, or with an alarming claim, I'll put it that way. What is the basis of what this report's saying? What is the report, and what's it really trying to get across here?
Yeah, well, let me start with this. The U.S. House Judiciary Committee, of course, the U.S. House, Republicans have a slight majority in the House. The Judiciary Committee and some other House committees have been investigating the border crisis for a couple of years now. As the Center Square has reported, more than 12 million foreign nationals have been apprehended illegally trying to enter the country, and that does not include a stat that's known as gotaways. Gotaways are those foreign nationals who illegally cross the border between ports of entry, are detected, whether it's by drone or some other video footage, by eyesight, by Border Patrol agents, but they aren't apprehended because there isn't enough Border Patrol agents on the border who successfully make their way into the U.S. and then disappear somewhere into the country. And so the House Judiciary Committee released a report this week about the number of known or suspected terrorists who are known or who have been apprehended at the southern border. And based on their report, certainly it's a Republican-based report. It's alarming. The Center Square has been reporting for a couple years now on this phenomenon, whatever you want to call it. But what's most alarming about this is the number of known or suspected terrorists who are part of that gotaway data, the ones that we don't know about, who have successfully made it into the U.S. unapprehended. And that's what this report was meant to highlight, is that, hey, we've apprehended, Border Patrol agents have apprehended hundreds of people who are on the International Terrorist Watch List, some of whom they've released into the country because there wasn't proper vetting procedures in place. But then there's also these unknowns, these more than 2 million unknowns who have successfully entered the country, were not stopped by Border Patrol agents, made it in the country. What percentage of those could possibly be known or suspected terrorists? And then what happens next?
And Dan, something somewhat interesting here. I mean, this report only seems to focus on those crossings at the southern border. But historically, this has been a northern border issue, which I don't think a lot of people would think of.
Yeah, there's so much attention paid to the southern border in regards to the border crisis, because that's where the floods of people are coming. And we know through the Center Square reporting, too, that we're just not talking about Mexican foreign nationals or Honduran foreign nationals or Venezuelan, Central American foreign nationals. Foreign nationals have been apprehended from more than 150 different countries across the world. Because of the volume of numbers at the southern border, you're right, that's where most of the attention is paid. But as the Center Square has reported over the past 2 years, the number of known or suspected terrorists who have apprehended trying to get into the country, actually significantly more of them have been apprehended trying to cross the northern border from Canada into the U.S. And that's a data point, and I'm surprised that the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, in its report, ignored the number of known or suspected terrorists that have come through the northern border, because they don't reference that data at all. They only reference the data of known or suspected terrorists from the southern border. So it's even more alarming, or it should be more alarming, than what the House Judiciary Committee report reflects.
And Dan, you mentioned, that these people are coming from all over the place. When you look at the numbers, these aren't small numbers. Chinese nationals, Iranian nationals, Syrian nationals, and many other places. One of the things, obviously, as you mentioned, it is a Republican report. We are in an election year. We can't ignore that. And I imagine that's why the southern border conversation is what they focused on. But as I mentioned in the kind of intro there, the report actually points to certain policies and claim that those policies are the ones that are resulting in these, agents releasing these known or suspected terrorists into the United States. So what are the policies that are in place that this report points to being the issue here?
Well, there are several different policy changes that once President Biden took office in January 2021, that he implemented on day one. And then over the course of his first 3.5 years in office, additional policies were added. The first few that come to mind is on day one, he ended former President Donald Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. What that policy was that people who try to get into the United States, claim asylum at ports of entry, at valid, legitimate ports of entry. President Trump's policy was you remain in Mexico until your asylum claim is processed. Honestly, that can be a couple-year-long process. The Biden administration on day one ended that policy. You could enter the U.S. at a port of entry, file an asylum claim, and you were allowed to enter the country, and you'd be given a court date at some point in the future. It's set. This wasn't on day one, but this sense, these future court dates that many of these foreign nationals are getting are 4 years in the future. Now, can you imagine? You enter the country, you make an asylum claim, whether it's legitimate or not, you disappear into the country and you're supposed to expected to show up at court 4 years from now. These folks aren't going to show up 4 years from now. So that was policy number one. Of course, one of President Trump's, when he ran for office back in 2015, 2016, he promised to build a border wall. He got 400 miles of border wall built during his term in office. President Biden halted that on day one. And then, of course, during the transition from former President Trump to President Biden, we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump also had a policy in place to prevent the spread of COVID in America. No one was going to be allowed into the country who didn't have a proper visa or was an American citizen who is coming back from traveling to Mexico. So those are some of the policies that started on day one of Biden's administration. Since then, the Biden administration has adopted other policies, including creating what's called a CBP for Customs and Border Protection, CBP 1 app. And what that does is it allows foreign nationals all over Central America, South America, etc., to apply on this app for an asylum claim, schedule an appointment, and then you're led into the country. You still get a court date, but again, it's years in the future now until that court date. So you're living freely in the United States. And the final part of this, I mentioned the 12 million figure earlier today. There have been so many migrants who have crossed the border into the United States that federal agencies can't keep up. And the vetting process of these agencies has suffered because of it. When someone attempts to come into the U.S., whether it's an asylum claim or whether it's between a port of entry, trying to cross the Rio Grande undetected, those kinds of things. If you're apprehended, you're supposed to go through a thorough vetting process before you're released into the U.S. And we know now that hasn't been happening because after the fact, even foreign nationals who have been apprehended by Border Patrol, stopped at the border, supposedly gone through a vetting process, released into the United States, after the fact, we've known that there have been arrests of some of those people are on the terror watch list, the international terror watch list. So it's troubling.
Certainly a story that's not going away anytime soon. You can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Cole and Dan for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What is California doing to stop local library boards from removing controversial books? How fast are students from one Detroit district finishing online credit recovery classes? And what do the latest job numbers mean for the direction of the economy and the potential for Fed rate cuts? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. There's a lot more to the newly enacted law eliminating Illinois grocery tax in 2026. Local governments can now impose their own 1% tax along with other sales tax increases. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker signed House Bill 3144, touting the relief he said the measure will bring. The elimination of the statewide grocery tax doesn't go into effect until January 1st, 2026, but the measure does other things that take effect immediately, such as allowing local governments to impose a grocery tax and increase other sales taxes, not through voter referendum, but through ordinance. Washington State's longtime attorney general and a former county sheriff will face off this November to be the state's next governor. Based on Tuesday night's initial returns, Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson will face former King County Sheriff and U.S. Representative Dave Reichert, a Republican, in the general election. Initial primary returns showed Ferguson in the lead with 49.5% of the vote, with Reichert garnering 27.92% of the vote. Under Washington's open primary system, the top two vote getters advanced to the November election, regardless of party. Republican attorneys general from 21 states, led by the attorneys general of Montana and Virginia, submitted an amicus brief to the U.S. Court of Appeals from the District of Columbia defending a federal lawsuit banning TikTok in the United States. President Joe Biden signed the legislation into law in April, expressing concerns that through Chinese-owned parent company ByteDance, the Chinese Communist Party might be able to gain access to users' private data or influence American youth toward communism. The law threatens to prohibit the app in the U.S. if ByteDance does not sell the shares in the social media company by January 19, 2025. TikTok and ByteDance responded with a lawsuit. A second member of the squad in the U.S. House was defeated in a primary on Tuesday as a county prosecutor defeated incumbent Cori Bush in the Democratic primary from Missouri's 1st District. Wesley Bell won with 52% of the vote to Bush's 47%, with 40% of precincts reporting to the Missouri Secretary of State. Bell received 56% of the vote in St. Louis County, where he is currently the prosecutor, but Bush received 55% of the vote in the city of St. Louis. U.S. Representative Jamal Bowman, a progressive Democrat and squad member from New York, lost his bid for re-election in the state's June primary. Days after removing nearly 500 non-citizens from voter rolls, Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose said more than 150,000 other voters have been removed as well. LaRose said all 88 county election boards finished the annual list maintenance process, which resulted in 154,995 voters being removed for being inactive or having out-of-date registrations. The removals were the next phase of an audit of the statewide voter registration database. Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs said she's not concerned that Intel's planned global layoffs could have an impact on the state. The technology company, which is one of the largest employers in Arizona, has drawn attention for wanting to cut 15% of its workforce worldwide. That's 15,000 people. Few other details other than possible cuts in Israel have been revealed. Intel is under scrutiny for the cuts after it recently was granted up to $8.5 billion in federal taxpayer money through the CHIPS and Science Act, which includes funding for semiconductor efforts in Arizona. The act is intended to serve as a way to take some of the pressure off of the island nation of Taiwan, which holds the vast majority of the semiconductor industry, as tensions there rise with China. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Back with more on the California bill looking to restrict library governing boards' ability to remove books. It's our Eliana Trudeau.
The California legislature is advancing a bill that would ban library governing bodies from banning a book or requiring that a book be purchased. Joining me to tell us more is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, what are the details of this bill and what it would do?
Hey, Eliana. Yeah, this ban would ban library governing bodies from banning books or requiring that a book be purchased. The state legislature's analysis of this bill notes that most ban requests in California and nationwide target, quote, books accessible to minors that include LGBTQ themes or sexual content. This ban would ban library governance bodies' decisions on librarians' programming decisions for events or displays. Notably, the bill doesn't really apply to libraries' maintenance or deaccession policies, suggesting that local library governance boards can still require that books be de-accessed. That's when books are removed for a wide range of content-neutral reasons. Maybe there's multiple copies of a book in the library, or there are copies available in nearby libraries. How nearby is nearby? Really up to the discretion of the board. Possible damage to books, or due to simply being outdated. So this bill would allow for removal of books for other content-neutral reasons that would not be challenged under the First Amendment.
And there's a couple examples of recent decisions by library boards that would be invalidated by this bill. What are some of those kind of real world examples?
Right. So Huntington Beach, which is in between Los Angeles and Orange County, their city council required librarians at Huntington Beach Central Library to put kids' books that contain, quote, content of a sexual nature into an adult section. The Senate Judiciary Committee noted that some of the titles included in this were Everyone Poops and several books from the series American Girl. The committee also noted that the Huntington Beach City Council is moving forward with a 21-member community library board to review books for sexual content to be either removed from the children's section or not purchased at all. And I assume that means not purchased for the children's section. There is opposition to this bill that does come from Christian grassroots organizations. Real Impact, a Christian grassroots organization, had this sample letter for supporters to fill out to send to legislators. It said, parents across the state are discovering that their child's school libraries are riddled with obscene content, and parents are beginning to call for the removal of these books. They wrote an opposition letter as well directly to the committee that said, the bill states the discretion to determine the content of materials in public libraries shall not be exercised in a manner that discriminates against or excludes materials on the basis that the materials may include sexual content unless that content qualifies as obscene under United States Supreme Court precedent. And then Real Impact said, this does not allow any room for the community to provide input on library materials, but imposes standards that may not align with the local community.
And this doesn't just apply to books. It also applies to any kind of programming that a library might have, right?
Right. This applies to programming and events. And in California, there have been different types of programming and events at library that have been opposed by different sides. Many libraries have drag queen story hour where individuals in drag read to children. And there are also events where there are speakers saying that there should not be trans individuals in women's sports. Last year, librarians at Davis ejected an in-progress forum on policies regarding transgender high school athletes. They said the content of the forum was disrespectful and in violation of the library's code of conduct. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a First Amendment nonprofit legal organization, said the event was protected by the Constitution under free speech and got the library to allow the event to be rescheduled. I talked to FIRE about this bill, and they offered a very neutral assessment. This is a First Amendment first organization. They said, amid the culture wars, it's important for public libraries to stick to their mission of providing the public with access to a wide range of ideas and information. Government officials need to remember that the First Amendment prohibits them from purging library collections of ideas they disagree with. You shouldn't be able to tell which political party is in power by scanning a library shelf.
So where in the legislative process is this bill?
This bill passed the Assembly and goes to the California Senate Committee on Appropriations. One more thing to add is librarians are people of all kinds of different political affiliations, often reflecting the communities that they're in, sometimes not. And this bill largely shifts things in favor of the librarians from community organizations.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With the latest on online credit recovery courses for high school students, we'll go back to Eliana Krug.
Students at a Detroit combined virtual school took their online credit recovery courses 20 times faster than the courseware provider suggests in the 2023-2024 school year. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, through a public records request, you found some interesting details on the use of online credit recovery courses at one Detroit school. What did you find?
Yeah, so what I found was that for an 11th grade and 12th grade English language arts course, students were just blowing through it, right? So I asked for actually, I think 3 or 4 different courses, but these are the ones that were available and kind of pursuant to my request. So, like, there's specific language there of like, oh, we couldn't find it, so that we'll give you what we can. So basically, what I was asking for was the amount of time it takes students to complete these courses, right? The specific courses at this specific school, which is called Detroit Lions Academy. And that is like a combination, like in the 2020, I believe it was this school year, they combined a couple of different schools together. And so there was like virtual sort of schools, like an alternative school there. So that's Detroit Lions Academy. And essentially they, in the 11th grade English language arts class, 23 students completed it in an average of 4 hours, 14 minutes, and 20 seconds. And then the 12th grade class, 11 students took it, and they completed that course in 4 hours, 3 minutes, and 24 seconds. So what this is active time in the courseware, and the courseware basically logs students' active time and like idle time. So I think if you're looking at a screen, it shows that. I asked for both, and what I got back was the active time. So it showed that that's how much active time it took. So then the next question is, well, how long is it supposed to take? And what we found was that the courseware provider, Edgenuity, said it's supposed to take 80 hours of active time for these courses. So these are specifically credit recovery, online credit recovery courses, and that is what they recommend. So Edgenuity says it should take 80 hours for uncustomized year-long credit recovery courses. So if this week, these are both first semester. And so it's like, this is the essentially, I think that you could argue like, okay, if it's supposed to be 40 hours, they're still blowing through this. Even if it's supposed to be like, half of a year, right? It's supposed to be 40 hours. They're doing it in a tenth of the time, right? This is like not really the speed at which they're supposed to be going. And it's kind of, it raises questions like, how much are students learning if they're just going through it that quickly? And more concerning, and I asked for these specific courses because I've seen them online from somebody who was cheating and offering cheating services to other students through social media and saying basically, if you pay me this amount of money, I will do your Edgenuity for you or your Adventum, like your online coursework for you. Give me so much money and your login, and I will do it and complete it for you, and then you can graduate on time. Like, so basically this is like a new kind, again, like cheating's not new. We've known, as long as there's been like quills and paper and like work to turn in, like people will try to find a way to like not do it. Like, I'm not saying like, okay, that's new, but these kind of digital ways to do it, I think are sort of novel. And that, the ease of that, of like saying, okay, like I can just pay somebody on Venmo, $60 and get a course and get my coursework done because I don't want to do it. Like, it's easier to do when, a teacher's not looking at the handwriting, right? It's like very clear that because it's just clicking a button, right? So I think that is, very, very clear. 34 students here completed the entire course, and which should have been, a week's worth of work, or maybe 2 weeks. So it's just like this kind of time frame is just very, very quick. And I asked the Detroit Public School Community District about it. They didn't get back to me. Just like a lot of big questions that are raised by this sort of quick time on these courses, just because we've written so much about how students can Google questions. They can find these answers on sites like Brainly. That one is like one that's very popular. And even in some cases, you can just use an app to like show, like take a picture of the screen, and then it'll tell you the answer because it can like automatically put that in. There's AI, there's different like sorts of messaging, sorts of ways to cheat. You can find cheating pretty much any social media platform. There are people who are selling it, and it's just kind of, there's so many different ways, and it makes you think, like that social media user who is advertising these specific courses, was advertising with these specific courses, said, I can do one class in a day if it's unlocked fully. So basically, if students have access to just blow through the course material and then the assessments, then that user can get through it in one day. And so that's, that's sort of the findings of the public records request.
And so there are some ways to keep students accountable in courses like this. Like, what kinds of measures are there, and do we know if any of them were in place here?
Yeah, we don't know if any were in place because I asked, what do you use? There are some safety measures that Imagine Learning, which is the company behind Edgenuity, which is the courseware provider here for the Detroit Public School Community District. They do offer something called IP blocking. So you can limit to where students can take the courses. So let's say you have like a specialized like seminar where your kids are supposed to be working on, your students are supposed to be working on the courseware, they can only do it at school. So then you have somebody who's, ostensibly proctoring them and making sure that they're not cheating, using Google, that kind of thing. You can maybe have special school devices where you can look at their screens while they're at school. But if you have that off, then you can give those credentials to another person. They can take that, and it could be, they could be in Norway for all we know, right? And so if you don't have that IP blocking on, you're not sure where your kids are taking the courses. They also have something called Speed Radar now, which automatically flags tasks for review. This is a quote from the website, when students are progressing through activities more quickly than expected. So I reached out to Edgenuity, and I didn't hear back in time for publication. I still haven't heard back about what would set that off. But that's another thing that I think districts can implement now. I think that's a pretty recent thing. Since I've started reporting on this, Imagine Learning has actually published like a whole, here's how districts should have like a cheating policy and like kind of prevent some of these like outside, some of these variables from getting into the coursework. So how do we make sure that there's academic integrity going on, and have like a whole sort of litany of like solutions and sort of like, here's best practices for the district. And I was asking Detroit if those were followed, and I didn't get a response.
Well, Brendan, this is a story we've followed for a while, and we will continue to follow it as new things come to light. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to dig into the labor market and its impact on the Fed rate, it's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, we had a lot of data that landed. The jobs report came in, and it came in with the economy adding only 114,000 jobs. That's not a great number. And then we have corresponding unemployment at 4.3%, that's going up. We've talked about like sort of the environment in which, sort of job seekers are kind of maybe fewer job seekers right now, people not as willing to apply for jobs. And of course, I continue to just hear on the street, people who are out of work just having difficulty finding the kind of job that they wanted to find at the kind of pay that they maybe had previously had, specifically for people who have been downsized. There's just a ton to unpack here. So let's let you just jump right into it.
Totally. Remember, we went from a super hot housing market during the pandemic, one where workers were in the driver's seat. Employers couldn't keep workers, right? Couldn't find them and couldn't keep them. And
you said housing market. You mean you meant to say labor market? Yeah.
That's right. In the jobs market, and it was a market where basically the wage growth soared. The workers are cleaning in the driver's seat. The unemployment was stuck very low, and this jobs market basically it went from hot to neutral, right? And maybe even a little bit weak in the last month. In the latest number. So I think what we see here is hiring continued to slow, employment increased less than expected. And basically, I think recession fears are starting to creep up, and the market's now pricing a 50 basis point rate cut for September because of those concerns. The unemployment rate, besides the pandemic job loss, the unemployment rate's now up to 4.3% from 4.1%. It's the highest it's been, again, aside from the pandemic, it's the highest it's been since February of 2018. So we're seeing that increase. Now, the thing, though, to keep in mind is that if the unemployment rate is rising because we've got a surge in the labor force, an increase in the labor force, maybe coming from immigration, for example, right? Then there's no reason to be too concerned, because an increase in labor supply was basically helpful to loosen the labor market somewhat. Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, most of the decline is coming from less hiring, but also more layoffs, then there are reasons to be concerned. So far, layoffs remain low. Hiring has slowed, but layoffs remain low. We've had a big increase in labor supply. And so those are good things. In fact, if we continue to get increases in labor supply, then we'll likely continue to see both employment increase, but also unemployment, the number of people unemployed, also increase at the same time.
That's an interesting phenomenon. So, and kind of getting into the grit of the jobs report that came out. And of course, these are always amended, but the initial report, healthcare and the social assistance industry.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is government, not government light. It's government funded jobs. That made up 64,000 of the jobs in this market. And then there was an additional straight 17,000 straight government jobs. So, you're talking about 81,000 of the 114,000 jobs that were added per the report.
Yes.
Coming either directly from or indirectly with help, a significant portion of them from taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about this in the last month. Job gains have been concentrated in a number of sectors. Some of them are sectors that took a long time to recover from the pandemic. But remember, it's not just how those jobs are created. There's also a ton of demand for healthcare services. Right. Since the pandemic, right? It's been rising. Our population is also aging. And so that demand for healthcare is pushing wage growth in that sector higher still. And it's attracting more workers to the sector, right? So it was crippled by major labor shortages for a long time. And so that could explain part of why we're seeing the big uptick in healthcare and social assistance. I thought one positive thing was the increase in employment in construction. Hopefully more private sector construction, more residential construction, because that's exactly what we need in this country, more residential housing being built in order to close a massive housing unit deficit that we have across the country. Another thing I think to highlight about this jobs report is wage growth has slowed. Wage growth has slowed to 3.6% year over year, down from 3.9% in June. So we're really seeing the slowdown here, right? Part of it is the supply side effect I mentioned earlier. And part of it is the cool down in labor demand as well. I think we're seeing a jobs report that is closer and closer to the edge of the cliff. And that means the Fed will cut interest rates it's almost guarantee, 100% guarantee.
Yeah.
In September. Again, we will see what happens this month with the CPI number, and the PCE number. But I think we're there.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Cardodal. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.